Okay. Awesome. Thanks so much, Nick, for being here today. How's it going?
It's going well, man. It's been a busy week, as we were mentioning before the call here. Just got back from a trip to Peru, which was awesome. Lots of great pictures, lots of great food, but ready to get back to work. And yeah, it's been a beautiful day here today, so I can't complain.
Love to hear it. Love to hear it. So maybe I'll just give you a quick intro. You work for Martin Brower and you are the team lead over there about training systems and process. So I really want to get into the nitty-gritty there around innovation and what you've done like throughout your 5 years at the company. Maybe I'll just, let's jump into the deep end here. There's 1,100 people that work for Martin Brower in Canada. And I read on your LinkedIn this really cool stat, and I want you to take me through how it happened. From October 2019 to November 2020, you claim to have saved them $1 million in cost savings. What was all that about? That's a lot to save in the first year.
For sure. Yeah, it was an exciting time, I think, in 2019. So I joined Martin Brower in June of 2019.
Hmm.
So I was super new to the business. Honestly, most of my experience had come in marketing, which is what my degree was in from
Yeah.
Western. And then just mostly in Excel history, in
Hmm.
Excel past. I did a lot of workshops and had some small businesses during university that allowed me kind of harness my Excel skills, which those Excel skills were really honestly what got me the job at Martin Brower. And I think one of my main focuses and passions when I got to the business was just kind of looking at the problems that we had, looking at the
Hmm.
tools that we were using, and trying to find ways to simplify it. As
Hmm.
somebody who was new to supply chain, I was kind of walking into a world that was infinitely complex.
Hmm.
So it was I would say challenging kind of to find places to start. And the role that I first started with at Martin Brower was in a supply planning role. So I was doing most of the ordering for things like buns, bagels, English muffins for the restaurants for McDonald's in Canada,
Hmm.
which is a decent book of business, which is where the opportunity for that $1 million in cost savings kind of came in. And we were coming into a time where we were using a lot of 3PL for some of our goods, as contingency, especially around LTOs and limited time offers and things like that. McDonald's is a company who focuses on ensuring supply. If you go to natural disaster sites in Canada, McDonald's is open and selling all of their food. If you go during the pandemic when there was tremendous difficulty across the country, McDonald's was doing everything that they could
Hmm.
to ensure supply in every single restaurant, no matter how they were open at any capacity. So I think in that mission comes with a decent amount of cost expenditure to
Hmm.
make sure that you can reach that level of quality. And I think when we sat back, we took a look at it in the fall of 2019, which is pre-pandemic. We're looking at, look, how do we simplify our supply chain? How do we take 3PL out of it? How can we touch these POs less in the system? How can we make it easier for our DCs to kind of on a national basis enact contingencies where possible? So that a large part of that $1 million came from, I think, diverting 3PL costs. So we were able to bring a lot of stuff in house. We were able to work with the suppliers to change the production schedules to be producing more frequently. So we had to hold less product at given peaks in kind of the product cycle,
Hmm.
which was a really big benefit. The additional portion of that cost savings came from unifying our English muffin RINs. So our RINs are also our SKUs, basically just a product code.
Hmm.
We were using two different product codes nationally. So one had one extra dozen essentially in the case versus the other one.
Hmm.
And that had just been legacy in the system for years, many years before I had got there. We were kind of looking at once again in that spirit of trying to simplify the supply chain, make the contingencies easier to enact, more flexible east and west. So we said, hey, let's see if this is possible. Met with all of our suppliers, built the business case for McDonald's. It was kind of a no-brainer once we put all the math on paper. And yeah, it was going to be a little bit of work to transition to make sure that we weren't wasting any product on that old code, and that we were getting all the suppliers kind of on pace with what the quality required, what the new case pack would be.
Hmm.
But ultimately, we were able to do that. Combining the 3PL and the English muffin stuff. I think we were just under the $1 million mark.
Hmm.
And then we had a couple other initiatives where we were taking two buns that were on the menu that were redundant, harmonize it into one so that we were able to reduce some costs there. And if you added up a few of the small things to go with a couple of those big things, we got $2 million, which I was really very happy about. And it kind of opened my eyes really early in my career that if there's a perceived issue, or there's maybe an area where redundancy is obvious, don't just like accept that. I would say dive into it deeper.
Hmm.
What are we really looking for out of that supply chain, kind of from a first principles perspective?
Hmm.
And I don't want to say zero-based budgeting and seeing what costs that we need to spend to service the lane, but
Hmm.
it was certainly a factor to figure out, okay, what, like, do we need to have two RINs? Do we need to use this 3PL and things like that? Those were kind of the strategies that we used to get to that $1 million mark.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I think a lot of people would look at that and be like, wow, okay, jumping out of university, like what kind of impact can have in a business? And a lot of people, I think, after the first 2 years or something in their job, they don't necessarily feel like they've done a ton of impact. It's crazy to see. This is possible. You join a business and do $1 million of cost savings in the first year. So your mandate being when you joined was around simplifying things, or was that something that you took on your shoulders specifically and that you felt like was needed within the company?
So that's something that I think ever since my late university days, I've realized that I really like to do.
Mm-hmm.
I really like to find kind of simple solutions for problems that appear
Uh-huh.
complex. I would be lying if it wasn't a need that was identified by McDonald's and the senior Martin Brower stakeholders as
Yeah.
well. The complexity with the bun supply chain,
Uh-huh.
not that it was overly complex, but things can always be simpler,
Yeah.
especially after going through long periods of time where you're just crushing results and you're maybe not necessarily worried
Mm.
about fixing things that are broken. So I think we had got to that place in the bakery portfolio where everything was going really well, but it was how can we start to make this more of a position of strength? So I took a look at it in terms of maybe we should unify this English muffin ring like I mentioned. McDonald's was pushing and was very confident that we would be able to mitigate the 3PL in some capacity.
Mm-hmm.
So we did have some I don't want to say pressure from McDonald's, but they pointed out a great idea and
Mm-hmm.
a great area of improvement, and we were happy to take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just really important to come in and I think just accept kind of the role that you're given. I was very lucky that Martin Brower trusted me with that opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
especially with the fact that I had very little supply chain knowledge. I think they kind of leaned into the fact that I was a fresh set of eyes
Mm-hmm.
and that I was someone that would maybe come in and I made it very clear from the beginning that I was always willing to express my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be good or bad. And that's helped me and not helped me in my career.
Mm-hmm.
But I think early especially that's great because people see that you're willing to try.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can be kind of helped and mentored and been given advice to be willing to try in areas that you can actually make an impact. I think that's the number one thing that I've learned kind of as year over year in my short career is just being better at targeting those areas where we need to put effort in and then leading that effort. So
Awesome. And so you mentioned there's a few things that you did to get to that million. There's two bigger parts of that. I'm sure when, you started, there was, 10 conversations going on. There was Excel sheets and data flying all over the place. It wasn't clear what the path was. How did you, in one sense, define that to yourself and to your team to be like, hey, these are the things we should focus on? And then two, how did you, make that case to the stakeholders so that they had the buy-in for you to spend the time doing these things, right? Because they're not free changes. There's things that need to change really in a big business like this, and it costs money
definitely.
to do the cost savings too. So take me through that process.
Yeah, so I think it all started with saying, okay, let's map our
Okay.
contingencies. Kind of what are our worst case scenarios? What if this building goes down? What if
Mm-hmm.
this supplier goes down? What if we can't use any of the product in the east? What if we can't use any product in the
Mm-hmm.
west? And I think during that exercise, we realized that the 3PL, specifically for English muffins, having the two different RINs and the two different case packs, posed a lot of issues to the flexibility that we wanted. So I think we set out in that mapping exercise to understand where the pain points in the process
Mm-hmm.
were. Once we identified through a lot of like root cause diagramming and really talking with stakeholders that were involved in every part of the process, we were able to identify a few key areas that were really big pain points, which is one, the overmovement of product and the 3PLs that I mentioned. Two, the inability to sell product that's produced in the east on the west,
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa, create a lot of contingency issues, especially if we have one of the bigger suppliers go out in one of those regions.
Mm-hmm.
Are the smaller suppliers able to maintain that capacity? And kind of what is the time that's required to get a different RIN into the system if it's not previously set up? I think looking at those two main things, there was a lot of area for improvement. The production schedule as well. Once we realized like, hey, we're holding maybe too much product using all the 3PL, kind of how can we not add risk to the system while lowering the national days of supply? What do we need to do with production schedule? Do we need to improve the relationship with any of our bakeries? Do we need to change the frequency that we're talking about our production schedule and the flow of product in and out of buildings? I think looking at all of those nuances are really important because you want to identify the root causes of the problem. And I think that goes back to your point. It costs money to do these system
Hmm.
improvements. McDonald's and Martin Brower want to be sure that we're enacting the right system improvements.
Hmm.
So really having to go through and make slideshow after slideshow, Excel file after Excel file, proving to the folks at McDonald's who take the quality of their business so seriously. I think that rigor really helps us make sure that the ideas that we're actually executing are successful. And I think that's one of the things that Martin Brower and McDonald's do very well together.
Hmm.
I think Martin Brower is one of the top executors in the world, especially in QSR supply chain,
Hmm.
and McDonald's knows that, and they're willing to push us. And what's great about us is McDonald's has this culture of this three-legged stool where it's their suppliers, their restaurants, their company, their customers are all together, and they're all in this, and we're trying to figure out the way to really execute the best.
Hmm.
And um, I think the rigor of needing to prove it to McDonald's was great,
Hmm.
and that gave me and the team a lot of confidence in the plan that we were enacting the right plan
Hmm.
because of the level of rigor that we not only went through internally but also with our customer in McDonald's. So I think that's really important. And even if you don't have that rigor self-imposed, like your customer isn't that rigorous, or maybe your managers aren't that rigorous, I think there's a lot of value in like what Jeff Bezos says, there's one-way doors and two-way
Hmm.
doors. The choice to unify English muffin rins nationally for McDonald's is a one-way door. So you want to make sure that when you make that decision, it is the best for the
Hmm.
business. Sure, some of the 3PL decisions we made, you could argue are two-way doors because you can always get additional 3PL, but the concept in general of 3PL downsizing and simplifying your supply chain is a pretty expensive two-way door. So I would argue it's a one-way door, and your level of rigor around one-way decisions I think needs to be higher. McDonald's is really good at making sure that we have that rigor, then we're good at executing on it. So I think that kind of explains the process,
Yeah,
you know?
that's great. That's great. What I love that you said there was, I started the question with, there's all these data sources that you can find. And what was interesting that was that you didn't say like, oh, we filtered all the data and we did it this way. What you said was like, we looked to make sure we had the right data. So, do we have the process map? That's an important piece of information. You can give as many Excel
Yep,
sheets as you can, but I need to map the process to find the bottlenecks. And then finding the
exactly.
bottlenecks and finding the levers kind of to push and pull within the business. And then I think the feedback you mentioned is really important too. So having the right data, finding the bottlenecks, and then getting the feedback from McDonald's, from your stakeholders to make sure that the plan makes sense before actioning it. I think those are all, I think, really key steps and probably, pretty generally important when you're looking at any process and wanting to improve it. So getting the right data, getting the right feedback, and pushing on the right bottlenecks. Yeah, so I mean, generally that's super cool. I'm wondering, within that, you did a year and you did this, and we'll jump to the next question. Just one last one here. How do you stop? How do you not get into kind of analysis paralysis? Because you have a year, you got to do the work too. You can't just spend the whole time analyzing. What is too much analysis? What's not enough?
Yeah. I think so there's no answer that I'm gonna give you that'd be like, I have your secret
Yeah.
for analysis paralysis. I think for me what's really important is ensuring that you get the initial analysis right.
Mm.
So taking the time to speak with everybody involved, doing those process maps, fishbone diagrams, uh, Pareto distributions, like doing all of those very highly technical project management process mapping allows you to really, with a first principles idea,
Hmm.
kind of understand like what you want to do and where the pain points are.
Hmm.
I think too often people, and I made this mistake early in my career a lot. I got a lot of advice from managers that, hey Nick, before we fix this, let's just understand what we're working with,
Hmm.
like fully, instead of saying, okay, I'm 20% into my scoping, I've seen the problem, I know what the solution is, now let's go and get it. That's typically a recipe for rework.
Mhm.
If there's anything that I learned while studying for my PMP and using that skill set is the most important steps in a project are initiation and scoping,
Mhm.
because those are going to lay the foundations for you for the actual execution and for the quality measurements that you're going to make down the
Mhm.
line. So I think taking the time to really understand who your important stakeholders are, what's important to them, what's the goal for the business, understanding kind of how the process interrupts our ability to do that,
Mhm.
getting stakeholder feedback into what they think the solution will be, assembling the team that you're inevitably going to use to solve that problem,
Mhm.
getting their feedback on the information that you have. And once you firmly have everybody's perspective, you've mapped everything out, you've identified the pain points. Those pain points have maybe been verified by some other people who are looking at similar information to make sure that we're arriving at reasonable results. I think from there, once you build an execution plan off of that, sure, some things are going to go wrong, you're going to have to adjust, but you've baked in a lot of the issues, I think, by that point, by getting all of those perspectives. Sometimes you don't have time to do all that. Sometimes it's a little bit rushed. Sometimes you need to do it quicker. And I think it's just about getting experience to be able to scale up and scale down that scoping, those scoping exercises, kind of as you have time. And once again, if it's a two-way door, maybe we're not doing all this analysis. Maybe a more iterative
Mhm.
project management style, kind of a minimum viable product,
Mhm.
and moving forward with incremental feedback is best. But for one-way doors, I think a thoughtful preliminary analysis reduces the probability that you will need a supplementary analysis down the line. And I think being really, really rigid on that, identifying kind of what situation you have, and then using your time and your resources accordingly,
Mhm.
I think is something that really helps us, and something that I have gotten a lot better at in the last year or two, especially since I moved into the team lead role. I think once you get into a role that's process management, process improvement focused,
Mhm.
it's really it becomes half the battle to identify how much time you need to start scoping each initiative
Mhm.
so that you can start to execute as soon as possible without, I'm going to use air quotes, wasting the time of stakeholders during the scoping process. So I think that's what I would say. I think being very, very tactful in the beginning is very important, but also understanding maybe how much level of detail is required. And I think playing with those variables up and down, I think will typically lead to success.
That's awesome. I mean, there's so much good information there. I think for anyone like in any business looking at a process and being like, hey, I think we should change this. I think what you're saying is like start with, what is this change going to affect? Is there, like you're saying, is it a one-way door? Is it a two-way door? Is it something we can easily revert? If it is, hey, let's try to move fast because we can always go back. If it's a one-way
Yes.
door and it's a big ROI maybe, then it's like let's really take the time to understand this and make a plan that works, and use some of the frameworks like you just mentioned, to plan it out before we attack it. So I think those are probably just two different types of problems that you have to look at differently when you're thinking about the amount of analysis you have to go into. Um, so okay, so I want to jump to a different question or a different topic a little bit. You were working at Martin Brower during COVID, and the supply chains got just crazy during COVID times. So I don't know if these are one-way door or two-way door problems, but I imagine you had to move fast no matter what. What I saw on your LinkedIn was that you able to reduce the time needed to make these supply plans. Maybe you can also tell us what supply plans exactly are by almost
Yep.
50%, and it looks like you created over 20 of them within the time frame that existed there. I don't know how many were needed across the country, but would be really curious to see, like, what was that process like? What is supply plan? How are you able to cut it down so much? And how did everything we just talked about influence that?
Yeah, so I'll definitely go into this. So I started at Martin Brower as a supply planner,
Mm-hmm.
and then just around the pandemic, I became what we refer to as an execution planner. So I won't go too into detail on our structure, just because I believe the structure of our business is where a lot of our strength is.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, I'm sure everybody who goes to McDonald's sees there's items that come to the menu for a short period of time, whether that be like the chicken Big Mac,
Mm-hmm.
or there's an orange chicken shake out now, or the Big Arch Burger, for example, that's out now. These things come into the menu for short periods of time, typically 3 to 8 weeks. You can have situations that are longer, but they're usually drinks. And one thing that Martin Brower was really good at in 2020 and going into the pandemic was executing regular replenishment items. So what I mean by that is the burgers, the buns, the cheese, the boxes, all the core stuff that every McDonald's sells every single day. Martin Brower has an outrageous fill rate on those items. And that's because we are, one, very meticulous, and the cost of quality is different for us, because McDonald's, obviously with the brand that they are, they demand and they expect premium quality service
Mm-hmm.
over and above what would typically be expected. So I think for us, um, during that time, it was really important for us to focus in on these limited time offer products, these products that came in for short period of time, which inherently cause complexities. You're dealing with a supplier, you're typically finalizing your recipe. There's not that much time for you to produce that, get it approved by quality, and get it distributed to 1,400 restaurants across the second
Wow.
largest geographic nation in the world.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to go along with that. So once again, Martin Brower identified a pain point, said, hey, we have teams dedicated to our regular replenishment items.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really have anybody whose job it is to be a specialist in bringing these items in, dealing with the nuances that come along with that, and being the liaison between the restaurants, the supplier, and McDonald's corporate, who are often making those top-down decisions on promotional timing, marketing impacts, and things like that. So we created a team at Martin Brower that had one lead and a few planners whose job it was basically going to be to go in and tackle this problem. It was taking us a long time to plan these promotions because they were out of people's regular day to day.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did was myself, a few more very talented planners, kind of got together with our lead who was assigned to it and said, let's look at every step of this process. And I'm going to repeat myself a little bit from the first question, but and I will sing Amber Collins' praises, who was our team lead
Mm-hmm.
when this team started. She said, let's figure out what we've got. I know we've all seen the issues with some of these tools and the redundancies and how we can fix it,
Mm-hmm.
but let's just start by laying everything out in a line,
Mm-hmm.
every step that we need to do. Let's just get a checklist of everything that needs to be done. Let's start crossing out stuff that doesn't need to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Let's circle stuff in red that needs to be addressed, and let's just get after it.
Mm-hmm.
So we were quite literally fixing the airplane as we were flying
Yeah.
it. People use
That's saying,
that
yeah.
saying thank you, but that's literally what we were doing. So we went through. There were a couple major tools that Martin Brower uses to plan their supply plans,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll get to what supply plans are in a second.
Mm-hmm.
But we went into each one. We said, how can we use our Excel skills to merge a bunch of these so that we can limit the amount of copying and pasting
Mm-hmm.
and the amount of different files that we need to have open at once to be able to go through and find information. How can we leverage um, workflows and VLOOKUPs across sheets to bring information into places that we're manually inputting now? How do we find a way to, because there's various participation types for all these promotions, how do we, as easy as possible, indicate in our system which types of restaurants are going to be selling which types of goods,
Mm-hmm.
and then enact those system updates accordingly? So I think when we went through everything start to finish, we really wanted to fix the cross-functional communication with McDonald's. We wanted to make it easier for them to make educated
Yep.
decisions. So I think we tackled our tools from the beginning all the way to the end,
Mm-hmm.
centralized a lot of things, actually formally written, documented everything
Mm-hmm.
instead of just getting best practices from kind of who was best at different steps.
Yep.
We centralized that knowledge management, we refined the tools, and then once we were able to roll all of that up, it was literally taking us half the time to plan these
Yep.
promotions than it was in the beginning. And what I mean by these promotions is when you get, let's say, a muffin, for example, and an LTO muffin's going to come in. There are probably 8 or 9 raw materials that are associated with the actual production of that muffin.
Mm-hmm.
Probably 3 or 4 of them, the supplier who's producing the item is going to use in a bunch of stuff. Like they're going to use flour and everything. They're going to use sugar and everything. It's going to be the more niche products that are going to be unique to the McDonald's system.
Yep.
So what we do is we essentially are planning on using minimum order quantities, batch quantities, lead time, how much raw material that we need to secure in order to protect performance of the forecast to X level, which has been determined by with McDonald's.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot of back and forth. We're working at the raw material level. rolling that up into the production level, looking at quality code dates. When should we produce this? Should we produce 4 weeks before the program, 5 weeks before the program? Are we going to have time to go back into production after the program is started once we have a read on sales?
Hmm.
So there's a lot of nuances, and the performance aspect of this really, really is where McDonald's tries to make their bread and butter, because we will wait as long as possible to make production decisions.
Hmm.
McDonald's will leverage the power they have in the market and the fantastic relationships they have with their suppliers
Hmm.
to remain flexible. We'll maybe produce to cover the entire forecast before a program starts if we think it's going to be a popular item. And then if performance goes crazy, within a day, we are on the phone with suppliers, working on production schedules, working on when we can get product in. Do we need to speed up trucks? Do we need to reorganize the product that we already have in the network to get out all of our current restaurants to the replenishment date with the product that we're working on producing? So there's a lot of nuances in the beginning. We refined our tools to make that scenario analysis a lot easier, and a lot easier for us to communicate that with McDonald's,
Hmm.
which makes us all more confident in our plan. We're able to pivot much easier because of the processes that we have established and the communication channels that we've established, not only within Martin Brower and at McDonald's. So that allows us to pivot quicker. And I think overall, that 50% number that you mentioned was specifically in the planning of LTOs,
Hmm.
because that's where a lot of the legwork is done at Martin Brower. But overall, end to end, this is very quickly in a 3 or 4 year period gone from an area where Martin Brower needed to make some improvements to a bona fide strength in our business, and something that McDonald's, especially in our current economic times where base volume and in the economy, maybe people aren't going out to eat as much, they're relying on these LTOs, these core menu promotions, to drive that incremental volume to try and get them to where they budgeted.
Hmm.
And had we not put the emphasis on the execution of these products specifically 3 or 4 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to lean into it as the strength that it is today. So I think, once again, it speaks to understanding the process, looking at the pain points, but having your North Star goal in mind and saying, okay, how do we get here through the refinement of our tools,
Yep.
through the improvement of our reporting, through better communication channels and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I love it. And what's really cool there is, so you reduce the time it takes for the 50% by going back at the process and in a way almost kind of doing like this zero-based budgeting, but almost like zero-based process review. Like you're looking and
Exactly.
you're like, what is redundant? Let's get rid of it. What is super important? How do we optimize it? And really being, almost, like vicious in your approach of just like really tackling that. And what's really cool when you reduce the amount of time by 50% or amount of work is that, if McDonald's has to do twice as much of this kind of thing and it becomes an advantage, instead of, you're able to do that now with the same number of people versus if you had to
Exactly.
do the double and you didn't change the process at all and you just said, okay, hey, this is the way it works, we're gonna have to do it. You probably have to put, I mean, at least twice as many people, if not more, plus all the training that goes into it, et cetera, and the process doesn't get better. So yeah, I mean that's an awesome example, and I wonder if you can speak more to that, what I just said, which was the like zero-based process approach. I don't know if there's a term for that, internally or within the kind of logistics world, but it does remind me a lot of like zero-based budgeting, but kind of on the process side.
Yeah, and so zero-based budgeting is the term that I'm aware of.
Uh-huh.
It stretches into supply chain as well,
Okay.
and I think in our world, I think we need the concept of zero-based budgeting a lot more.
Mm.
I think even when things are working well,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important to say, can we do this with less resources? Not because we necessarily want to,
Mm-hmm.
but it's how do we free up those resources to maybe do something else?
Mm-hmm.
So I think for me, zero-based budgeting, especially in recent years, just having tried to educate myself more, listen to more podcasts, listen to more books,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to grow as a professional, I think zero-based budgeting is a really important tool. It's something that I don't think is used as much, but I think the power of really understanding what it takes to do something, not sure we can do this with 10 people, but what does it require to do
Mm-hmm.
this? I think has really helped me um, better really conceptualize the goal of the project a lot more as well. Because when you're thinking about how to do things in as least resources as possible, you better be sure that you know exactly what the goal is or what the desired outcome is, because you're scraping the barrel.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I think it circles back to understanding the objectives primarily,
Mm-hmm.
and then using almost zero-based budgeting and first principles thinking, which I think go hand in
Mm-hmm.
hand, as tools to remove as much of the dirt away from the treasure as possible. So I think for me, that's how I think about zero-based
Yeah.
budgeting. Uh, I don't I'm not necessarily in a role where I'm planning headcount
Yeah.
and doing things like that. But for me, I would argue zero-based budgeting is almost more helpful in process
Mm.
management, because there's always like nuances to headcount and stuff. Like people always do stuff that's even outside of their job, and it's tough to quantify. But when I'm looking at a process, like I can see the inputs, I can see the stakeholders, I can see what the desired outputs are, and if you map things right, it's pretty easy to trace that back to see where your problems are. So I definitely use it as a very helpful tool, especially in those first couple stages of a project, to make sure that we're finding the right North Star.
Love it. Love it. Need more zero-based budgets everywhere.
Agreed.
Everywhere we need them.
Agreed.
Um,
Couldn't agree more.
so
Couldn't agree more.
I'm curious. So I want to pivot a little bit to kind of the technology question. Nick, you mentioned a little bit. I mean, one was tools. I think you mentioned Kanban. I'm curious because, you know, I think people, when it comes to spending money, buying tools, etc., it's, being in a business, you have to make a business case internally before you make an investment, etc. I think AI is an interesting
Yep.
one too. How are
Yep.
you looking at that, and how are you able to, one, make the case to change a process to buy new technology to move faster? And then, how are you yourself, looking at AI in terms of the same thing too? Because I think, you've probably have integrated a lot of software to help save time and money. And now with AI coming in, which is like this whole new thing too, how does that play into the picture as well?
So I think so this is a great question. I think we are still in the stages of identifying the pieces of technology and
Mm-hmm.
kind of this wave that we're in that are going to be sticky,
Mm-hmm.
and the things that are kind of easy to get caught with the tide on.
Okay.
I think fundamentally what we've tried to set out to do is, of the tools that we use,
Mm-hmm.
so our forecasting system, our ERP system, we use Smartsheet as a project management
Sure.
tool. We have a couple other service providers. We have Snowflake for
Yeah.
our data lake. A lots of stuff. We use Power BI.
Mm-hmm.
I think really understanding what new functionality those tools will have incorporated is important.
Mm-hmm.
If there's one thing that I've learned from even the most global leadership at Martin Brower, it's we already use a lot of tools that are among the best
Mm-hmm.
in their specific industry. So let's not necessarily run around with like we're chickens with our heads cut off, trying to find out what we can plug in to keep us relevant.
Mm-hmm.
We're very comfortable with our performance globally in terms of an executing business.
Mm-hmm.
So what can we do to supplement that? And I think the organization is doing a good job of taking a long-term approach of looking at maybe those next level technologies that can make actual step changes, but looking at them in isolated use cases first.
Mm-hmm.
We're a very large business. We do a lot of McDonald's business in a lot of countries around the
Yeah.
world. Canada I'm biased, but is one of my favorite countries that we do business
Yeah.
in. It helps that we have one customer in Canada. There are a couple Martin Brower countries where they have a few different customers,
Uh-huh.
but we're very lucky that we have one customer and we can really dial into what that customer needs. So we don't need to really consider different customer needs
Mm.
and everything like that. We are wholeheartedly dialed in on making sure that McDonald's Canada and our other Martin Brower markets that'll learn from us are set up for success. So I think understanding our tools, we've had some improvements in some of our tools that we've onboarded quickly that have definitely helped.
Mm-hmm.
I think as companies like Smartsheet layer in more generative AI stuff
Mm-hmm.
into their actual tools, that'll be helpful as well. I know a lot of people at Martin Brower are using ChatGPT like
Yep.
things, whether that be for text, for little problem solving, or for other things like that. Martin Brower and Reyes Holdings actually just released their own private GPT
Nice.
that has higher data
Yeah.
security and is much safer from a data perspective. So now we've really opened that up to people at our company in terms of not just people who are maybe being the early adopters and using ChatGPT themselves, but we have a system-wide solution that is admittedly not perfect at the start,
Mm-hmm.
but I think we'll quickly plug the holes and it needs to be a viable alternative. We're constantly looking for ways to incorporate all of our documentation into that. So, and this is something that's I think one of the major step changes for me, especially in my role, is we've spent really the last 2 years documenting information, making sure that the information was digestible and easy for all of our planners to one access and two to understand and use.
Mm-hmm.
I think the next iteration of that, and we have day in the life documentation that outlines everything a planner will need to do with links to all the resources that they will need to do it. And sure, it's not perfect, but it's got 90 to 95% of the stuff. I think how in my world, how do we get to a place where when somebody onboards, they get access to a chatbot that knows all of our
Mm-hmm.
processes. So not only do they have access to the information, they can ask that chatbot, "Hey, I'm doing this process. Where can I find this document?" Or, "Hey, I'm reading this document and it just doesn't make sense to me. Can you articulate it in a different way?"
Yep.
I think that is potentially one of the lower hanging fruit, massive use cases that I can definitely see us implementing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the kind of thing that nothing in our current tools will let us do that. So we've rolled out this private GPT now, which is a new piece of technology that we'll use,
Mm-hmm.
and we will scale it to what we need to scale it to. We've done a great job of putting committees in each market in place to kind of consolidate that feedback and report it to the powers that be
Mm-hmm.
so that they can make informed development. And I think that process is something that Martin Brower will continue to do. I think we identified a need, we put something in the marketplace, kind of a minimum viable product, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to improve it, and in a year, maybe a year and a half's time, we're going to be in a place where we have a really good, safe solution internally.
Yeah.
I can see us doing that with a lot of things. I know we have people go to like the Gartner
Mm-hmm.
conferences and a bunch of conferences around North America to learn like how are global supply chains enacting this type of technology.
Mm-hmm.
We're also looking at things like intelligent digital workers. So basically bots that have a thinking chain and are able to complete complex not only tasks
Yep.
but thinking in between and then action those things. So how do we look at for our supply planners, for example, all the things that just go perfectly, that the system proposes the order, places the order, it doesn't have any issues, it's 5 days a week into each DC like clockwork at the same time. How do we take that stuff and how do we automate it so that our people are dealing with the problems that our machines currently can't handle instead of having to spend time on redundant work where the machines can just take care of the work. So I think finding that distinction as well, in terms of kind of what does the first generation of that look like, what does the second generation of that look like, we're trying to figure out, are our current tools enough to get to exception based planning?
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is, are you dealing with only issues? Are you not dealing with anything that goes status quo?
Mm-hmm.
um, I personally think we do have the tools to do that. Now we have a lot of little micro tools and steps along the way that will need to be developed, but I think we're really open to that in areas and in situations where there's potential value. And I'm lucky that the job that I'm in, we have leaders that are willing to try and are willing to hear out that use
Mm-hmm.
case and are at least willing to be convinced. I think it's the job of senior leadership to be skeptical, mildly skeptical on a lot of this stuff to protect the business from going in directions that maybe aren't as
Mm-hmm.
fruitful. Um, I don't see that as a blocker. I see that as once again required rigor,
Mm-hmm.
vetting good ideas from bad ideas. So I think it's my job and our team's job to bring good ideas forward and to talk with the business to see what they actually need in terms of tools. But that rigor, being able to bring those ideas forward and things like that are really important. So I think over the next year, as some of our business cases get ironed out for a lot of these things, Martin Brower is going to be among the leading supply chain companies in terms of how we implement this stuff, and it's not just going to be because we ran in front of the pack and tried to be first. It's honestly because we took a thoughtful, tactical approach and put it in the right areas. So
That's perfect. What I would describe that as just like a really sober approach to AI. It's not getting caught up in the hype. It's knowing you know your business and knowing where you could
Yeah,
find improvement. And then, when those things come, let's do it. But before those things happen, let's just keep doing what we do, and keep winning kind of within our own process. So I think that's a really, really great way to say it. And I think probably would help a lot of people and a lot of other businesses to think about how they're looking at AI and how they could think about it differently, to be on the cutting edge, but also not to be taking risks unneedingly. Um,
absolutely.
I have one last question before we wrap here, and it's a little bit kind of, so I think we talked a lot about obviously Martin Brown, McDonald's, the really kind of nitty-gritty operations. We talked a lot about like PMP process. I think that was amazing. I think it'll be really interesting for people to see, how does a professional actually look at these things and go from, step A to Z, get a process changed, make a
Yep.
lot of ROI. But for someone who's in a business and a large business too, 1,000, 5,000 people like the one you're in, and they themselves are within a process, they're flying the plane to say, what are the steps you would give them or tips you would give them in terms of how do they start, making the repairs, getting the space they need to analyze the process as it needs to be? How do they identify if it's a one-way door, two-way door? Like, what would you say to someone who's maybe not a job is to be a process improvement person, but is more so seeing that processes could be improved? They want to go about this zero-based budgeting within their work. How do they get started? What would your advice be to them?
So I think so it's hard.
Hmm.
Like people, I'm very fortunate that I get to be in a position in a job in a company that literally it's my job to think about these kind of
Hmm.
things. I think before this was my job and I was doing other jobs and I was trying to quote fix the airplane while I was
Yeah.
flying. I think it's really important when things bother you
Hmm.
or like when you're working on a process and you're like, man, this sucks. Like there's definitely a better way to do
Hmm.
this. Just to like I just started putting stuff like that on a list.
Mm.
And it got to a point where I keep it in my inbox and I'm a guy who likes to keep my inbox
Yeah.
clean. So when I go, I see things sitting in my drafts. I go and I look at them.
Yeah.
And day after day I was just looking at problems that I was having.
Hmm.
And eventually you're like the 10th time you look at a problem on a list, you're like, what if I tried this?
Hmm.
And then you try it yourself. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. If it works, then maybe you show a couple of your colleagues,
Hmm.
and if it works for them, then maybe it's worth like showing your manager or showing the people in the business whose job it is to centralize the knowledge management or kind of taking that next step. I think process improvement works best
Hmm.
in an organization, and this is coming from someone whose job it is for process
Yeah.
improvement. Process improvement in an organization works best when everybody improves their own processes
Okay.
because everybody knows their own process is the best.
Hmm.
That's how we improve the bun and bakery portfolio supply planning. That's how we improved all the promotional planning. That's how we improved the tools that the planners use to access all of our knowledge management and all of our SOPs is like this isn't working. Why isn't it working? What would you ideally have? Typically the ideal is actually not that far off. It's just people don't know it, so they don't try it.
Hmm.
So I think like being willing to take that 5 extra minutes if it's not your full job for process improvement
Hmm.
to say, hey, this is bugging me. I think we could do it better this way. What do you think?
Hmm.
You compound that over a year, or you do that maybe once or twice a month
Hmm.
for a year. That's 20 things
Hmm.
that bugged you that you did something about. And even if you didn't fix the thing entirely, the issue entirely, it's contagious.
Hmm.
You see that a little bit of effort can make a big impact, especially when you're on a bigger team. It makes an impact not only for you, but for other people. For me, that's almost infectious.
Hmm.
And I think really sitting down, making a list of those things, once I made my list, then you know what? I sorted them easiest to
Hmm.
hardest. And I would tackle the easy ones myself. And when I had the opportunity to meet with leadership and one on ones or things like that, I would bring up the hardest ones and I would say, hey, I'm having this issue. Like, what do you think about
Hmm.
this? And oftentimes they were like, wow, I didn't know this was actually an issue that somebody was having. We can maybe do this, this, and this to try and help that from our
Yeah.
perspective. So I think this that kind of speaks to the contagious word that I used. And
Hmm.
once one person starts to improve things and we see improvements from that, and then leadership sees, oh, they're having this issue and they're trying to solve it. Maybe let's try and help them solve it. your snowball gets bigger as it rolls down the hill. And then it's easy once everybody is bought into process improvement to say, hey, maybe it makes sense to have one team or one guy in this entire department whose job it is to kind of look after these things and make sure that during our busy seasons, those projects aren't just falling to the wayside. We have someone whose job it is to make sure we're improving 12 months of the year.
Hmm.
I think that's how we got to the position that we're at Martin Brower, where we have a team who's dedicated for it.
Hmm.
And I think that's how anybody can start. At the beginning of the month, if you have a list of things you don't like, say, I'm going to try and fix one thing this month. And even if you don't do that every month, maybe you'll fix 7 or 8 things by the end of the year. And I think even your willingness to do that shows well if you want to grow in a business. Because if you're willing to fix the little problems that are hard to fix, um, with not a lot of experience, as you get experience, people are going to trust you to try and combat maybe bigger problems because you've proven a propensity to try and to be willing to push through those roadblocks. So I think just kind of summarize what I said. I think it's really important to um, really understand what the issue is. I think it's really important to summarize that succinctly. And then I think it's really important to just chip away on it, especially if you don't have a lot of time. Bring in people on your team, get their help, but really do it with a foundation of I'm trying to make our lives easier
Hmm.
here. I'm not just trying to make work. Like, how is this improvement going to improve our processes? And then get people to buy into that. People typically buy in when things are getting improved and are going to be easier for them.
Hmm.
The only time that I have ever had a process improvement idea not be excitedly welcomed by a team is when I or my team did not personally explain the benefits of that project properly
Hmm.
in the terms that the functional group wants and understands.
Hmm.
It's not their job to enact process improvements
Hmm.
because I say so.
Hmm.
It's our job to improve the processes that will actually make an impact for the group. And I think keeping that mindset is once again a good North Star when you're trying to tackle any process improvement project.
That's amazing. That's super, super actionable. So if anyone's here listening, they want to get started, start on your list, find the first thing, start actioning it, and if it's really hard, tell your boss. I think that's that's a great way to end. Really appreciate that, Nick. Just before we go, where can people find you? Where should they be looking for you? What else are you up
Yep.
to? Let us know.
Yeah, so on LinkedIn for sure. Spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. I'm posting on posts every now and again on there. I definitely stay active. I'm in a few different communities, so it's cool to connect with like-minded people on LinkedIn. You can definitely find me there. I'm also in the Smartsheet community. This is definitely a more niche community, but we have a really good group of problem-solving people that are kind of in that community that we help each other
Mm,
out, and there's a lot of use cases with Smartsheet that can help in all aspects of businesses from data input to data visualization and
mm.
everything in between. So I think primarily find me on LinkedIn, but if anybody's ever surfing around the Smartsheet community, you can definitely find my name in some of those forums too.
Sick, sick. We'll put all the links to that in the description. So, guys, head over to the Smartsheet forums and say what's up to Nick.
Thanks for your time,
Thanks so
Connor.
much. Thanks. Okay, great.